Today we're going to be talking about a subject that affects us all, prices. And we're lucky enough to have with us in the studio the Secretary of State for Prices and Consumer Protection, Mrs. Shirley Williams. Can you tell me what effective steps you've taken to control rising prices?
Yes, indeed. And I think I have to say that I've always said there are some things you can do and some things you can't do, and I'll now list the things that I've tried to do. We, first of all, declared a cut across the board in the retail margins of profit by 10%. We extended it not just to fresh food, but all the way across, including all the non-food items as well. We then declared a 3-month gap between price increases, except in a few very rare cases. We ended the business of increasing prices of goods bought at the same price for stock, goods on display, the so-called sticky label racket. The next group of things we did was to bring in a prices bill, which is now law, which enabled us to subsidise foods, and under it we've subsidised bread, milk, butter, flour and cheese. And that's not the end of it, there'll be others. We took powers to require the display of maximum prices for these subsidised foods, and the orders on that are going out at the present time. We took powers to introduce unit pricing of particularly fresh foods, especially fruit and vegetables, meat and fish, and the first orders on that too will be going out in the next few weeks. We entered a voluntary agreement with the retail trade covering essential foodstuffs which weren't subsidised in an attempt to try to keep the margins down as low as possible on that. And finally, we've taken steps with the local authorities to greatly extend consumer advice centres, and we hope that in a short space of time these will also engage in price monitoring. That's just on the prices side. I will leave out the consumer protection side where we've tried to do some things also. Net effect, you want to ask, between 4 and 5 points on the food index up to now, with a bit more to come.
Well, there's lots and lots of points to take up there, and perhaps we could start with subsidies. Now, the classic argument, as you must know only too well, against food subsidies is that we all get them, regardless of whether we need them or not. And to back this up yourself, you said recently in the House that only a quarter of the people who benefit from subsidies earn less than £30 a week, actually 24%. Are they then the best way of helping people who need help?
Oh, Tony, you've got yourself stuck into a statistical difficulty that all the House of Commons got itself stuck in, so I can't blame you. No, it's 24% of households. But you see, most pensioners are households of 1 or 2 people. So that many households represents far more people than the household figure gives you. Now, we know 3 things about this. The first is that pensioners benefit most. They actually benefit in absolute terms most. That's to say they make more out of subsidies per head than anybody else in the population. Reason for this, quite simply, they buy more staple foods and they spend more of their budget on food. They don't spend the same amount on cars and holidays and entertainment that no doubt you and I do. So they benefit the most, absolutely. They also benefit the most proportionately, and so do poor families. Other part of the argument, I'll be as quick about this as I can. Of course it's true that the average benefit of 60p a week goes to everybody, to Mr. Claw and to Mr. 40 and to you and me and to pensioners. But the great difference is that anybody who earns over £60 a week is paying an extra tax much more than he's getting in subsidy. And anybody earning under £20 a week is paying nothing extra in tax at all. So the whole of the subsidy benefits him. It's what we call a give and take scheme, quite simply.
But isn't it true that the point of subsidies is completely lost if the good effect they have on lowering the cost of living is completely eroded by the government's decision to put extra charges on the services of nationalised industries, things like electricity and gas, which pensioners need just as much as everybody else? I mean, isn't that whole effect completely eroded away, and therefore we're back to square one?
As I began this programme by saying, there has been a definite impact on the food index and a definite impact on the pensioner index. And the reason for this is that although I agree with you, nationalised industry prices do affect the pensioner does spend more of his income on food and rent, the 2 crucial things that have been directly affected, in the one case by subsidy and the other by freeze, than does anybody else in the population except the very poor large family. Now, coming to nationalised industries prices, I mean, obviously as the prices minister, I hate seeing nationalised industries prices go up, but I think it's fair to say that the scale of the subsidy was running at about 1,400 millions at the end of February, that the only way to sustain this would have been a massive further increase in income tax and other taxes, including VAT. And therefore the feeling was in the government, and indeed in the Conservative government before it, that we had to set a ceiling to these nationalised industries' subsidies. And the only other point I would make is this. We have tried to protect the less well-off. For example, rail fares to commuters have gone up substantially less than rail fares for people travelling into city, because our studies have shown us that commuters include far more lower paid people.
But you mentioned the word income then. Isn't it really better to give people the money in some form or another, like increased pensions or family allowances or even less tax or some sort of tax credit? Then they can decide what they themselves would like to spend the money on.
You know, it's no good giving people pensions with one hand and then seeing the whole lot eroded by increases in prices on the other. But the other point I want to make is this, because I think you have got a serious point about family allowances. Subsidies affected the cost of living immediately. It takes perhaps 4 weeks, 6 weeks to bring in a subsidy scheme, at least in areas where you can properly inspect it. There are some things like meat where I've always admitted it's very difficult to do. You can't bring in a new family allowance system in anything like that time. You've got to print the books, you've got to set up the staff and so on. So can I just say this to you quickly? The subsidies have never been intended to be permanent. They're intended to take the top off inflation. There is nothing in subsidies to preclude the government moving on to family allowances, moving on to higher pensions, but it can't be done as quickly. It even took pensions up to July to be done, although Mrs. Castle worked overtime and so did her staff, and that was the shortest possible time.
You've just announced your latest subsidy on tea.
Yes.
And on our programme you said you would subsidise margarine and maybe cheaper cuts of meat and eggs. How do you choose these particular foodstuffs to subsidise?
I'm surprised at that. I honestly thought that I'd said that I would try to hold the margins on meat, because I've always been dubious about subsidising meat, and I've said so quite often, but perhaps I've lived and learnt since I was last on your programme. It is possible to subsidise some meats, and of course we have brought the cheaper cuts of meat within the voluntary agreement with the trade. That's to say, the agreement to hold down margins. But the broad subsidy, straight subsidy on meat is the most difficult of all, because there are so many small butchers, and unlike bread or milk, the supply is not in the hands of a relatively small number of suppliers. We've done tea, not because, frankly, tea is a rich nutritional food, we all know it's not, but because tea is overwhelmingly the drink of pensioners and the less well-off. It's as you move up in income that you move into coffee as the main substitute. And so, true to our desire to above all peg the cost of living of the less well-off, we've deliberately chosen tea. And the other thing I would say about tea is that it's, apart from the fact that it's of some benefit to a very badly off part of the world, which is something, a small consideration one does take into account, the other thing to be said about tea is that there were, of course, some increases coming along on the auction markets, which we wanted to offset. Margarine, well, let me be quite blunt, the price of margarine is being held by the subsidy on butter, and it would be a question of simply throwing one lot of money after another. But the other substantial problem about margarine is that margarine is particularly difficult to subsidise because of the problems of the butter surplus.
I mean, how long will these subsidies last, say the tea one?
I think they will last until we return, if we ever do, to a more normal level of commodities. Now, let me put this as clearly as I can. We've seen an increase in raw material prices, as your programme has often pointed out, of between 2 and 3 times over in the last year. I don't believe we'll ever go back to the prices of 1972, because we've got the oil quadrupling in price, and that flows through into everything. But already the commodity markets are beginning to show some fall back to a slightly more normal level. Maybe it'll only be 10 or 20%. It won't be halved or quartered back to 72. As the prices of the commodities begin to fall, we would seek to phase the subsidy out. The subsidy was meant to take the peaks off inflation. It wasn't meant to be, and can't be, a permanent feature of our economy.
And if you can do it on subsidised foods, why can't you do it on everything?
Well, 2 answers to that, really. One is that on the first part, we are obliged by the terms of the law itself to consult with the trade about the display, the form it takes, the way it's presented, where it's presented, and so on. And I don't think that any reasonable consumer would expect us not to consult with the trade. This is going to go up in every little shop, as well as every big shop all over Britain. And we don't want to do something that is impractical, that we do out of our great Whitehall knowledge and that we don't ask them about. So this will be coming out, the order will be coming out very, very shortly, and the display signs themselves, I hope, by the beginning of the autumn. Now, with regard to imposing maximum prices on all goods, we could do it, but the whole point of the voluntary agreement was to try to do it by agreement and not by law. And the early monitoring we've done on the voluntary agreement, and it's of course in an early stage because it's only been in being for just over a month and 5 weeks and a bit, has shown that the prices of goods under the voluntary agreement, of all fresh foods under the voluntary agreement, have fallen. Now that's partly seasonal impact, I wouldn't disagree with that, but it's also partly the agreement. And I suppose that I would say to your viewers what I've said to the trade: if we can do it by agreement, then we can do it more quickly and more flexibly. If the agreement doesn't work, then I would have to bring in statutes. But let's be quite clear, bringing in statutes would mean hundreds and hundreds more civil servants, and they would have to be paid for by the taxpayer.
Lots of people actually have said to us that they would welcome a return to retail price maintenance. What's your reaction to that? Do you really think that in these inflationary times it might actually help to control prices?
It wouldn't. There are two areas where retail price maintenance still obtains, books and drugs. And one can't say that there has been a notably lower increase in prices in those fields than across the front. My own belief is that the return of retail price maintenance would mean an immediate leap in the cost of living of as much as 1 or 2%, because I think that the pressure on the most efficient shops to show that they are selling below recommended prices, and many say exactly that, would be removed by the return of retail price maintenance. Let me be quite blunt, it's much simpler for the shopper. It makes life much easier, but it's got nothing to do with keeping prices down, nothing at all.
Just an administrative device. Before and during the election, and in this studio, there was a lot of talk about speculation in commodity markets. We talked about this a little earlier on, markets in things like coffee and grain. Now, you said at that time, and that was before you came to power, that there were means of controlling commodity speculation. You referred specifically to an idea of a commodity commission.
Yes.
Bearing in mind the present situation with regard to sugar, why haven't you brought in commodity commissions?
We've set up machinery already to look into it. It's a very complicated field, and already some work has gone ahead, I think it's fair to say, particularly in the Ministry of Agriculture. For example, the proposals that Mr. Peart has put up with regard to meat to the European Commission owe something to this concept. In the field of, in my own field, as I say, we're doing a major study of this. We do believe there is a speculative element in commodities that's important. But in the case of sugar, there is no evidence at all that there's a speculative attempt to drive up the price. What's happened in the case of sugar, quite simply, is that there's been a major diversion by the Caribbean countries, for very good reason, to the United States, where they're now getting between 270 and 280 pounds a tonne for sugar, when we are offering, under the Commonwealth Sugar Agreement, 79. Now, if I was a Jamaican Prime Minister, I would divert my sugar to the United States as well. We're in this difficulty, and we may as well, I think, tell people quite directly what the problem is. My colleague, the Minister of Agriculture, is engaged in negotiations to discuss a new sugar price. If he were to simply accept the present world price, the price of sugar in the shops would go up approximately 4 times over, but we'd get an agreement tomorrow and the supply problems would end.
Right.
I don't think it's sensible to bargain on the basis of a total collapse, nor does the Minister of Agriculture, and therefore we're trying to get the best long-term arrangements we can, which may include Australian sugar again, with the Caribbean countries, with the Commonwealth countries, and with the EEC. And I'm sorry that people are having to put up with a shortage, but let me make it clear, it is nothing to do with subsidies, because of course sugar is not subsidised.
What's your advice to shoppers in the near future about sugar?
We've issued advice to shops, let me say first of all, and asked them to try as far as they can to distinguish between regular shoppers and would-be hoarders. In other words, we don't like the pay £2 and you get £2 of sugar argument, because it's very hard on the pensioner. But we do think it's reasonable for shops to say to somebody they've never seen before, you can't come in here and buy only sugar. I saw the other day, I was travelling behind a car which had neatly packed up in its back window 12 £2 packs of sugar, and I found that, you know, a bit hard to take, frankly. My advice to shoppers is, don't suddenly pitch up your sugar demand. It won't help the situation at all. The situation should ease because fresh supplies are being brought in the next few weeks. If you can put off your jam making for a little while, please do.
Right. Can I ask you about your Prices Act? Because your Prices Act gives you power to legislate on prices, and yet you haven't really used these powers. Instead, you've preferred a voluntary agreement with retailers to make price cuts. Why have you chosen a voluntary agreement?
Primarily because it could come in right away. You see, if you read the Prices Act, you'll notice, and only a parliamentarian can sort of probably see this because it's very much in terms of the way it's expressed in legislation, that to bring in any order controlling the maximum price, not only do we have to consult with the trade about it, we also have to engage in a process which lasts for well over a month with Parliament itself of getting their agreement to the order.
Yes,
Now, all that would have put off price controls till about November.
But I mean, this, you say price control, but how can we possibly know, for example, which supermarkets are actually cutting their items by 10%? And do you have watchdogs out sort of making quite sure that they are doing it?
We've got a price monitoring system, and as I've said to Tony earlier, I mean, I can't put my hand on my heart and say I know it's working everywhere. In fact, I think it probably isn't working with a small minority. But the work we in the Price Commission have done so far indicates that over the range of the voluntary agreement, studying this in a range of shops from independents and voluntary agreement shops through to supermarkets, the price of the goods under the voluntary agreement has slightly fallen. And that's, I think, the most we could ask for in that situation. As I said to Tony, I have no hesitation that if the voluntary agreement breaks down, we will bring in the statutory powers, but it will only do the same thing with the addition of a fairly large mechanism of control, which we haven't got at the moment.
In one word, are we ever going to see a reduction in shop prices?
In one word, you've already seen a reduction in meat. I think it will follow, but not, as I said, generally until the new year.
Mrs. Williams, thank you very much indeed.